You ever watch someone build their own cage and not realize they're the ones stepping inside it? The smell of fresh-cut cedar hit me before I even saw the fence. That sharp, almost sweet scent mixed with the low hum of power drills and the steady thud of nail guns, echoing across my property like they belonged there. I slowed my truck to a crawl, gravel crunching under my tires, something in my gut already tightening before my eyes caught up with what was happening. The fence wasn't just close to the property line. It was on it. No, past it. A clean, straight line of brand-new panels running at least 30 feet into land that had been mine since 1998. I stepped out, boots hitting the ground harder than I meant them to, the late afternoon heat clinging to my skin as I walked closer, each step measuring distance without even thinking about it. Years in construction do that to you. You don't guess lines, you feel them. And this one was wrong. Real wrong. A worker glanced at me, barely slowing his drill. HOA project. He said like that explained everything, like that word alone gave them permission to redraw reality. I didn't answer. I just kept walking, fingers brushing along the smooth surface of the wood. Still warm from the sun, still tacky from fresh stain. Built fast, built confident, built like no one expected to be challenged. I crouched near one of the posts and saw it. My original survey marker, half buried, pushed aside like it was nothing more than a rock in the way. That small piece of metal had been there longer than most of the houses behind me. My dad and I found it together when I was 16, clearing brush in the summer heat, sweat dripping into my eyes while he showed me how to read land like a map. Lines matter, he told me back then, tapping that marker with his boot. You respect them, or you fight over them. I stood up slowly, dusting my hands off, and that same sentence echoed in my head as I followed the fence line all the way to the back. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about taking a few feet of land. The fence cut directly across the only access strip that connected their backyards to the drainage easement behind my property. Without that strip, everything behind it was trapped. I could hear laughter drifting over from one of the houses, the faint splash of someone watering their lawn, completely unaware of what had just been done to them. I pulled my phone out, opened the old survey files I kept saved, zoomed in, lined it up with what I was seeing. No doubt. Not even close. They hadn't adjusted a boundary. They'd crossed it, and they'd built something permanent on top of it. A slow breath filled my chest, the kind that steadies your hands instead of shaking them. I didn't call the police. Didn't yell at the crew. Didn't even take a step back. I just stood there, staring at that fence as the last panel snapped into place with a hollow, final crack. Because here's the thing about people who think rules don't apply to them. They never stop to ask who actually understands the rules better. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across wood that didn't belong to them, I realized something simple, something quiet, something that would take a few more days to unfold. They thought they were taking my land. What they really did was give me control over everything behind that fence. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was angry, but because my brain would not stop mapping lines. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind against the windows, it all faded under the quiet hum of calculations running in my head. Distances, easements, setbacks, access rights. By the time the first light pushed through the blinds, I already knew one thing for sure. That fence was not the problem. It was the leverage. The morning air carried that same sharp scent of fresh wood as I stepped outside with a tape measure clipped to my belt and a folder tucked under my arm. Dew soaked through the edges of my boots as I walked the line again, slower this time, more deliberate. I measured from the corner post to the old oak tree. 28 feet, 4 inches. Exactly what the survey said it should be on my side, not theirs. I drove a stake into the ground where the real boundary ran, the dull thud echoing in the quiet neighborhood. A couple of curtains shifted across the backyards behind that fence. People were watching now. Good. Let them. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos. Close angles. Wide shots. The marker they buried. The posts they set. Every detail documented, not for an argument, but for a record. There is a difference. Around 9:30, a white SUV rolled up slow, tires barely making a sound on the pavement. I did not have to turn around to know who it was. Victoria Hale always moved like that, controlled, measured, like the entire street was a stage, and she had already decided how the scene would go. Her door opened with a soft click, heels meeting asphalt in steady, confident steps. "Daniel," she called out, her voice smooth, almost pleasant. I turned, brushing dirt off my hands, keeping my expression flat. Victoria. She glanced at the stakes I had placed, then at the fence, then back at me with that same practiced smile. I was going to stop by anyway. I heard you had concerns. Concerns. I let that word hang for a second. That fence is sitting on my land, I said, calm, direct, no extra weight behind it. She tilted her head slightly, like she was considering whether to humor me or correct me. Our contractors followed the community alignment plan. Everything is within acceptable variance. Acceptable variance. I almost smiled at that. You might want to check the county survey before you call it acceptable. Her smile did not break, but I saw it tighten at the edges. Just a fraction. Daniel, sometimes these things are not worth escalating. It is a few feet. The community benefits from uniformity. There it was. Not denial. Not confusion. Just dismissal. Like ownership was flexible if it made things look better from the street. I nodded slowly, like I was thinking it over. So your position is that you can build on my property because it looks nicer? Her eyes flicked to the houses behind the fence, then back to me. My position is that we have the authority to maintain standards that protect property values. Authority. That word sat heavier than she realized. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and stepped aside, giving her a clear view down the entire fence line. Then you might want to take a good look at what you just built. She followed my gesture, scanning the length of it, confident at first, then slightly slower as her eyes reached the far end where the fence cut across the narrow strip leading to the drainage easement. I watched the moment register. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. Is there a point you were trying to make? She asked, her tone still controlled, but sharper now. I met her eyes, steady and quiet. No, I said. Not yet. For a second, the air between us went still. No wind. No sound. Just that faint scent of cedar and something else underneath it. Pressure. She held my gaze, searching for something she could push against, something she could dismiss. But I did not give her anything. No argument. No raised voice. Just certainty. Finally, she exhaled softly, smoothing her expression back into place. Well, she said, turning toward her car. If you have documentation, you can submit it to the board. We will review it. I watched her walk away, heels clicking in a steady rhythm that sounded a lot less certain than when she arrived. The SUV door closed, the engine started, and she drove off without looking back. I stood there for a while after, listening to the quiet settle back in. Somewhere behind that fence, a sprinkler system kicked on, water hitting grass in a steady, harmless rhythm. They still had no idea. Not about the line. Not about the access. Not about what happens when land gets reclassified under the right conditions. I picked up my folder, flipped it open, and ran my fingers over the old documents inside. Easement agreements. Zoning maps. Restrictions that had not been touched in decades. The kind of paperwork people forget about until it becomes the only thing that matters. They thought this was about a boundary. A few feet of dirt. A clean line for appearances. I closed the folder slowly, the paper edges sliding together with a soft, final sound. What they built was not just a fence. It was a mistake with a footprint big enough to change everything behind it. By midday, the neighborhood had settled into that quiet, curated rhythm that always made places like this feel controlled, almost artificial. Lawns trimmed to the same height, driveways empty except for polished SUVs, the faint hum of distant lawn equipment blending into the background like white noise. I sat at my kitchen table with the windows open, letting the warm air drift in, carrying the scent of fresh grass and that lingering trace of cedar from the fence. The folder lay open in front of me, pages spread out in a deliberate pattern, each document overlapping just enough to tell a story if you knew how to read it. Most people see land as space. I see it as layers. Ownership, access, restrictions, dependencies. And right now, those layers were starting to line up in a way that made the entire situation shift from annoying to precise. I traced my finger along the old easement document, the paper slightly rough from age, the ink faded but still clear enough where it mattered. A drainage easement running behind my property, established in 1982, with a designated access strip that cut directly through the section where that fence now stood. Not optional access. Required access. For maintenance, for inspection, for compliance with county regulations. I leaned back in my chair, letting that settle in my mind, the quiet weight of it replacing any leftover frustration. Because this was the part people always missed. It is not about what you own. It is about what others need from what you own. A knock at the door pulled me out of it, sharp and controlled, not hesitant. I already knew who it was before I stood up. When I opened the door, Victoria stood there again, sunglasses this time, her posture just as straight, but something in her stance had shifted. Less performance, more intent. "We reviewed your claim," she said without greeting, her voice cool, efficient. I stepped aside slightly, not inviting her in, just giving myself room to lean against the frame. That was fast. She held out a single sheet of paper, the edges crisp, the logo at the top bold enough to try and carry authority on its own. "The board has determined that the fence placement falls within acceptable community development guidelines. Your concerns have been noted, but no action will be taken." I took the paper, glanced at it, then folded it once, slow and deliberate. "So you are officially saying you are keeping it there?" Her chin lifted just slightly. "Yes." I nodded, sliding the paper into my back pocket like it did not matter. "Good." That word landed heavier than she expected. I saw it in the way her shoulders tightened, just enough to notice if you were looking for it. "Good," she repeated. I stepped off the threshold and walked a few feet past her, looking toward the fence line from a distance, taking in the full picture the way an inspector would. Clean lines. Uniform panels. Perfectly aligned with every other backyard on that side. Except for the part that did not belong to them. "You just made this a lot simpler," I said, turning back to her. She crossed her arms, the motion precise, controlled. "If you think this intimidates us in a changing course, it does not." I shook my head slightly, almost amused. "No, it does the opposite." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air sat still between us, the faint sound of water sprinklers ticking in the background, a car passing somewhere down the street, everything normal on the surface. But underneath that, something had shifted. She was expecting resistance. Complaints. Maybe a lawyer letter or two. What she was not expecting was agreement. I pulled my phone out and opened the county zoning portal, scrolling to the section I had bookmarked earlier that morning. "You know what a restricted land use designation does to a property, right?" I asked, my tone even, almost conversational. Her eyes narrowed slightly behind the sunglasses. "I am aware of zoning classifications." I turned the screen toward her, not close enough for her to read everything, just enough to show I was not guessing. "Then you know what happens when access to a required easement is obstructed." She did not answer right away, just watched me, measuring, calculating, trying to figure out where this was going. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. "You said no action will be taken," I continued. "That means the fence stays exactly where it is." A faint breeze picked up, rustling the leaves on the oak tree behind me, the same tree that had marked this boundary long before any of these houses existed. I could almost hear my father's voice again, steady and certain. "Lines matter." Victoria shifted her weight slightly, the first sign of something that was not control. "If you are planning to escalate this legally, you can go through the proper channels." I met her gaze, calm, steady, already 3 steps ahead of that suggestion. "I am not escalating anything," I said. "I am just going to use what is already there." That was the moment. It started to land. Not fully. Not enough for her to see the outcome. But enough for her to realize this was not going to be a standard dispute. She turned without another word, walking back toward her car, her steps just a fraction faster than before. I watched her go, then looked past the fence again, at the stretch of backyard sitting quiet in the afternoon sun, perfectly maintained, perfectly dependent on something they no longer controlled. And for the first time since that fence went up, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Because they had already made their decision. And now, all I had to do was follow through. The county office always smelled the same. A mix of old paper, stale air conditioning, and something faintly metallic that clung to the back of your throat if you stayed too long. I stepped inside just after 8 in the morning, boots echoing softly against the tile floor, the building still quiet enough that every movement felt deliberate. A woman behind the counter glanced up, offered a polite nod, then went back to typing like she had seen 1,000 people walk in with problems they thought were unique. I did not say much. I did not need to. I slid the folder across the counter, each document already flagged, each page arranged in the exact order it needed to be understood. Property survey, easement agreement, current obstruction photos. She flipped through it slowly, her expression shifting in small, subtle ways that most people would miss. First neutral, then focused, then something closer to interest. "You are saying access to this easement is blocked?" she asked, tapping the photo of the fence with the back of her pen. "Completely," I said, "and it is not optional access." She nodded once, turning another page, her finger tracing the line on the map where the access strip ran. "No, it is not." That quiet confirmation landed heavier than anything Victoria had said the day before. This was not opinion. This was structure. I watched as she reached for a different form, one thicker, printed on heavier stock, the kind that carried weight before you even read it. "If this is accurate," she continued, "this could trigger a restricted land use designation for the affected area until compliance is restored." I leaned slightly against the counter, keeping my voice even. "That is what I was thinking." She gave me a quick look, not surprised, just acknowledging that I had already done my homework. "You understand what that means, right?" I did, completely, but I let her say it anyway. "It means anything relying on that access cannot legally be used in a way that violates the restriction," she said, setting the form down in front of me. "Backyards included, if they depend on that easement." There it was. Clear. Simple. Final. I picked up the pen she slid across and signed where she indicated, the scratch of ink on paper sounding louder than it should have in the quiet room. No raised voices. No arguments. Just a line being drawn in a different place, one that mattered a lot more than a fence. When I stepped back outside, the air felt different. Not lighter. Sharper. Like everything had edges now. The drive home was slow, deliberate, the same way I had approached everything since that fence went up. No rush. No wasted motion. As I turned onto my street, I could already see movement behind the fence line. A couple of homeowners out in their backyards, one adjusting a patio umbrella, another dragging a hose across the grass, completely unaware of what had just shifted beneath them. I parked, stepped out, and stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The fence looked the same. Clean. Solid. Confident. But now it was more than wood and nails. It was the boundary of a problem they could not see yet. I walked along the edge of my property, stopping where the access strip began, the ground slightly worn from years of use, subtle but undeniable if you knew what to look for. That path had always been quiet, almost invisible to anyone who did not understand its purpose. Now it was the most important piece of land on the entire block. Around noon, a county truck rolled in, slow and official, the kind of presence that does not ask permission to be noticed. The logo on the door caught the sunlight as it pulled up near the fence line, tires pressing into the edge of the grass. A man stepped out, clipboard in hand, scanning the area with the kind of practiced eye that did not miss details. I did not approach him right away. I let him walk it. Let him see it without explanation. He stopped at the fence, crouched near one of the posts, then followed the line exactly the way I had the day before. Measured steps, pauses at key points. A quiet, methodical process that carried more authority than any argument ever could. After a few minutes, he stood, looked toward the backyards beyond the fence, then turned his attention to the access strip, the narrow piece of land that connected everything together. I could almost see the same realization forming, the same conclusion I had reached, just from a different direction. He walked back toward his truck, pulling a form from the passenger seat, the bright color of it standing out against everything else around it. I recognized that form immediately, not because I had seen it before, but because I knew exactly what it represented. He did not knock on any doors, did not call out. He simply walked back to the fence line and began placing markers along the edge, each one spaced evenly, each one sending the same quiet message. Something here is no longer normal. From behind the fence, I heard voices now, curious at first, then confused. The sound of a gate opening, footsteps approaching, someone asking a question that had not been necessary yesterday. I stayed where I was, just outside it all, watching the shift happen in real time. No confrontation, no drama, just the steady, undeniable weight of process moving forward. The same process they thought they could ignore when they built that fence. And as the last marker went into the ground, bright against the green of the grass, I knew something they did not. This was only the beginning of what that one decision was about to cost them. The first sign that something had changed was not the markers. It was the silence. By late afternoon, the usual backyard noise had thinned out, replaced by something quieter, sharper. Conversations that stopped when someone else walked by. Patio doors opening and closing more often than usual. The soft scrape of chairs being dragged back inside. I stood near the edge of my property, arms folded, watching it unfold like a slow shift in weather. A man from 2 houses down stepped up to the fence, his hand resting on the top rail like he was trying to understand it through touch alone. "Hey," he called. Over, his voice uncertain. "Do you know what all this is about?" I met his gaze, calm, steady. "Access restriction," I said. "County issue." He frowned, glancing back at his yard where a grill sat half uncovered and a couple of kids' toys were scattered across the grass. "They said something about not using the yard?" I nodded once. "Until it is resolved." The words landed heavy, even though I did not raise my voice. He ran a hand through his hair, looking back at the fence again, then down at the bright markers lining the edge like a boundary no one had noticed before. "That does not make any sense," he muttered. I did not correct him. It made perfect sense, just not in the way he expected. By early evening, the HOA group chat had already started to buzz. I did not have to be part of it to know how it sounded. Confusion first, then frustration, then the quiet search for someone to blame. And eventually, one name rising above the rest. Victoria. Around 6, her SUV pulled in faster than usual, the tires crunching harder against the pavement, the engine cutting off with a sharper edge. She stepped out, no sunglasses this time, her expression stripped of the calm polish she carried before. She walked straight toward the fence, heels pressing into the grass with more force than necessary, scanning the markers, the forms attached to a few of them, the official stamps that did not care about community standards. I stayed where I was, not approaching, just watching. She spotted me after a few seconds, her eyes locking onto mine with a focus that was no longer controlled, but contained. "There is a difference." "What did you do?" she called out, her voice tight, measured only by effort. I did not move. "Nothing," I said. "I filed paperwork." She took a few steps closer, stopping just short of the markers, like she understood instinctively that crossing them now meant something different than it did yesterday. "This is excessive," she said, gesturing toward the line of signs. "You are affecting multiple properties over a minor boundary dispute." I tilted my head slightly, letting that sit in the air for a second. "It stopped being minor when you made it permanent." Her jaw tightened, the smallest flicker of frustration breaking through. "You could have resolved this with the board." I almost smiled at that. "I tried," I said. "You gave me a letter." That hit. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the weight of the conversation back where it belonged. She looked past me toward the access strip, then back at the fence, her mind clearly moving now, connecting pieces she had ignored before. "This is temporary," she said, more to herself than to me. "We will have it reviewed." I nodded. "You should." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sun was dropping lower now, casting long shadows from the fence across the grass, cutting through backyards that were suddenly off limits in a way no one had planned for. A sprinkler system kicked on somewhere behind the fence, running for a few seconds before abruptly shutting off, like someone had realized it might not be allowed anymore. Victoria exhaled slowly, steadying herself, rebuilding that composure piece by piece. "This does not benefit anyone," she said finally. I met her gaze, calm, unshaken. "It benefits the law," I replied. That was the moment she understood this was not a negotiation, not a warning, not something she could smooth over with a meeting or a vote. This was structure, and structure does not bend just because it is inconvenient. She turned without another word, walking back toward her car, slower this time, each step measured differently than before. Not confident, not uncertain, just aware. I watched her leave, then looked back at the fence, the same clean line, the same perfect alignment, now sitting inside a boundary that had nothing to do with appearance. From behind it, I could hear a door close, then another, the quiet rhythm of people adjusting to something they did not choose. And I stood there, exactly where I had been since the beginning, on land that had not moved, had not changed, had not needed to. Because in the end, it was never about taking anything back. It was about letting the consequences reach exactly where they were supposed to go. The next morning did not come with noise. It came with hesitation, the kind you could feel before you even stepped outside. I opened my back door just after 7, coffee still warm in my hand, and the first thing I noticed was what was missing. No kids running across the grass. No early morning patio setups. No sprinklers humming across those yards like clockwork. Just stillness. A few blinds shifted as I stepped onto the porch, the faint creak of wood under my boots echoing louder than it should have in that quiet. The markers were still there, bright against the green, untouched, unquestioned. But now there were printed notices attached to several of them. White sheets with bold black text that did not blend in with anything. Official language has a way of doing that. It does not ask to be understood. It expects to be followed. I walked along the edge again, slow, deliberate, reading one of the notices even though I already knew what it said. Restricted land use designation. Temporary suspension of non-compliant access dependent activity. That was the part most people would not understand at first glance. But they were starting to. A man opened his back door halfway, stepped out, looked down at the notice, then back at his yard like it had changed overnight. He did not step any farther. Just stood there, uncertain, then slowly closed the door again. That told me everything. Around mid-morning, a second county vehicle pulled in, this one carrying more weight in the way it moved, slower, more deliberate. Two officials stepped out this time, one carrying a clipboard, the other holding a rolled-up set of documents. They did not need directions. They walked straight to the fence line, straight to the access strip, like they already knew where the problem lived. I stayed back again, leaning against the side of my house, watching the process play out exactly the way it was supposed to. One of them unrolled the documents against the hood of the truck, flattening the paper with both hands, tracing lines with a pen as the other nodded along. I could hear pieces of their conversation carried on the light breeze. Obstructed access point. Non-compliant structure placement. Dependent property impact. Each phrase landed like a quiet confirmation of everything I had already set in motion. After a few minutes, they walked the length again, stopping at the exact points I had measured days ago, verifying distances, checking markers, making notes that would become part of something permanent. One of them turned toward the houses behind the fence and gestured toward the yards, explaining something to a homeowner who had finally stepped out far enough to listen. I watched his posture change as he realized this was not a warning, not a suggestion, a condition. By noon, the shift had fully taken hold. Patio furniture sat untouched, grills covered, lawn equipment idle. It was not that they physically could not use their backyards. It was that now they knew they should not. And that difference mattered more than any barrier ever could. Around 1:30, Victoria arrived again, this time without the controlled pace, her SUV stopping short, door opening before the engine fully cut. She moved quickly toward the officials, her voice low but urgent, the kind that tries to sound reasonable while pushing for answers. I could not hear every word, but I did not need to. I watched the exchange. The way she pointed at the fence. The way she gestured toward the homes behind it. The way the official responded, calm, unmoved, tapping the document in his hand, then pointing toward the access strip. Structure explaining structure. No emotion. No flexibility. Victoria's shoulders tightened, her movements sharper now, her control slipping just enough to show what this was costing her. Not just authority. Credibility. She turned slightly, scanning the yards behind her, seeing what I had already seen hours ago. No movement. No use. Just quiet compliance driven by something she could not override. After a few more minutes, she stepped back, exhaling slowly, her posture adjusting again, trying to rebuild control where there was none left to take. The officials continued their work, unaffected, placing additional notices, marking boundaries more clearly, turning what had been a subtle shift into something undeniable. I finished my coffee, setting the empty cup on the porch rail, the ceramic making a soft click against the wood. The air felt warmer now, heavier, like the neighborhood itself was adjusting to a new shape it did not choose. I stepped down into the grass, walking the same line one more time, not to check anything, but to see it for what it had become. A simple strip of land. A quiet path. Now the center of everything. And behind that fence, stretching across every yard that depended on it, was the result. Not damage. Not loss. Just limitation. The kind that sits quietly until it changes how everything is used. I paused near one of the markers, looking down at the printed notice, then back up at the fence, the same clean line, the same careful construction. They built it thinking it would define their space. Instead, it defined their boundary in a way they never saw coming. By the third day, the neighborhood stopped pretending this was temporary. You could feel it in the way people moved, slower, more careful, like every step carried a question behind it. I stepped outside just before 9, the sun already high enough to cast sharp shadows across the fence line, and what I saw was not resistance. It was adaptation. A couple stood at the edge of their patio, talking in low voices, both of them looking down at the notice like it might change if they stared long enough. Another neighbor had moved a set of chairs from the backyard to the front porch, the scrape of metal legs against concrete carrying across the still air. It was subtle, but it was everywhere. The shift from use to avoidance. The understanding that something had changed, and it was not going away overnight. I walked the same path I had been walking all week, boots pressing into the grass along the access strip, each step measured, familiar, steady. The markers were still bright, but now they felt less like warnings and more like facts. No one had touched them. No one had tried to move them. That told me more than anything else. Around mid-morning, a small group gathered near the fence, 3 homeowners standing close enough to talk, but far enough from the markers to avoid crossing them. Their voices carried just enough for me to catch fragments. "We cannot even let the kids out there," they said. "Liability. This is going to affect property value." That last one lingered. Property value. The same phrase Victoria had used, now turning in a direction she had not planned for. One of them glanced toward me, hesitant, like he was trying to decide whether to approach or avoid. I met his eyes briefly, gave a small nod, then kept walking. I was not the one they needed to talk to anymore. Around noon, Victoria called for a meeting. Not official, not announced through formal channels, but word spread fast in a place like this. By 1 o'clock, a handful of residents had gathered near the entrance to the subdivision, standing in small clusters, the kind that form when people are looking for answers, but not sure who is responsible for giving them. I stayed at a distance, leaning against the bed of my truck, close enough to observe, far enough to remain outside of it. Victoria stood at the center, her posture back to that familiar straight line, her voice controlled again, but tighter now, like it was being held in place instead of flowing naturally. "We are actively reviewing the situation," she said, hands clasped in front of her. "This appears to be a temporary regulatory issue that we are working to resolve with the county." Temporary. The word landed, but it did not settle. One of the homeowners stepped forward, arms crossed. "We cannot use our backyards," he said, not raising his voice, just stating it plainly. "That is not temporary for us." A few others nodded, the quiet agreement spreading through the group like a ripple. Victoria maintained her expression, but I saw the shift in her eyes. Not uncertainty. Calculation. "We are exploring options," she replied. "There may be a path to modify the current designation." Modify. Another word that sounded flexible, but was not in the way she needed it to be. Someone else spoke up, a woman this time, her tone sharper. "Does that mean moving the fence?" That question hung in the air longer than any of the others. Clear, direct, unavoidable. Victoria did not answer immediately. Just a slight pause, just enough to confirm what everyone was already starting to realize. Because that fence was no longer just a boundary. It was the cause. I watched as she shifted her weight, her gaze moving briefly toward the direction of my property before returning to the group. "We will consider all options," she said finally. It was the closest she had come to acknowledging it. Not admitting fault. Not yet, but opening the door to it. The group began to break apart slowly, conversations splintering into smaller pieces, the tone different now. Less confusion, more focus. They had moved past asking what happened. Now they were asking what needed to be done. I pushed off the truck and walked back toward the fence line. The same steady pace, the same quiet rhythm. Nothing had changed physically. The fence was still there. The markers still lined the edge. The notices still fluttered slightly in the light breeze. But everything behind it felt different. Not because of what I had done, but because of what they were now forced to understand. I stopped at the center of the access strip, looking down its length, then out toward the backyards beyond it. The same space, the same grass, the same structures, but now defined by something invisible that carried more weight than anything they could see. And for the first time since this started, I knew the next move was not mine. It was theirs, because the only way forward now required them to undo the one decision they thought they had full control over. By the fourth day, the pressure had a direction. It was no longer quiet confusion, or scattered frustration. It had focus, and it had a target. I saw it in the way people moved when Victoria stepped outside that morning. Conversation stopped, then restarted in lower tones, heads turning just enough to track her movement without making it obvious. The same people who barely acknowledged each other a week ago were now standing closer, talking longer, sharing the same problem from different angles. I stepped out onto my porch just after 10, the sun already high, heat rising off the pavement in soft waves, and for the first time, I heard something that had not been there before. Agreement. Not loud, not confrontational, just consistent. A man near the fence line gestured toward the markers, then toward the fence, his voice carrying just enough. It is because of that. No one corrected him. No one argued. They just nodded. That was the shift. Cause and effect had finally connected. Around noon, a small crew truck rolled into the neighborhood, not county this time, but private. No logos, just equipment in the back and two men stepping out with that look of someone called in after a problem has already gone too far. They did not start working. They walked the fence first, one of them running a hand along the panels, the other crouching near the posts, checking depth, alignment, placement. The same process as before, but now with a different purpose. I watched from a distance, arms resting on the porch rail, the wood warm under my hands. They reached the section that crossed the access strip and stopped. Both of them stood there a little longer than necessary, saying nothing, just looking. One finally straightened up, shaking his head once, subtle but clear. That part was not right. A few minutes later, Victoria arrived, moving faster than usual but trying to keep it contained, her posture still controlled, her expression tight in a way that no longer passed for calm. She spoke with the crew in low tones, pointing along the fence, then toward the markers, then back again. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. What would it take? How long? If we adjust this section. Adjust. Not defend. Not deny. That word mattered. One of the workers answered, his voice steady, practical, the kind that deals in facts, not appearances. He gestured toward the posts, then toward the ground, explaining something that required more than just a quick fix. You do not move a structure like that without undoing what has already been done. Victoria listened, nodding slightly, but I could see it in the way her shoulders held tension. This was not the outcome she planned for. This was correction, not control. By early afternoon, more residents had gathered, not in a group this time, but in a loose line along the fence, watching, waiting, saying very little. The energy had changed again. Not anxious, not confused, just expectant. They were no longer asking what happened. They were waiting to see what would be done about it. I stepped down from the porch and walked the line one more time. The same steady pace, the same quiet rhythm. As I passed the section where the crew stood, one of them glanced at me, then at the markers, then back at the fence, like he understood exactly how all of this connected. I did not say anything. I did not need to. He gave a small nod, almost instinctive, then went back to measuring. That was enough. The sun dipped slightly as the afternoon stretched on, shadows shifting across the grass, cutting through yards that had been untouched for days now. A child stepped out onto one of the patios, took a few steps toward the fence, then stopped when a parent called them back inside. The door closed softly, the sound carrying farther than it should have in the still air. That was the real impact. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. Victoria stood near the center of it all, watching the crew, watching the residents, watching the situation she had once controlled now move without her permission. She caught my eye briefly, just for a second, and this time there was no challenge in it. No dismissal, just recognition. Not of me, of the position she was in. I held her gaze for a moment, calm, steady, then looked back at the fence. Same wood, same line, same structure. But now, it was no longer a statement of control. It was a problem waiting to be undone. And as the crew began marking specific sections with chalk, outlining where changes would need to happen, I knew something final had settled into place. Not because I forced it, not because I argued it, but because the only path forward now required them to reverse the one thing they thought they could take without consequence. The sound of the first post coming out of the ground was not loud, but it carried. A dull, hollow shift of wood loosening from soil, followed by the soft crumble of packed dirt giving way. I stood at the edge of my property, arms relaxed at my sides. watching as the crew worked through the section they had marked the day before. No rush, no shortcuts, just steady, deliberate removal of something that had been put in the wrong place. The smell of disturbed earth mixed with that fading scent of cedar, the sharpness of new construction slowly being replaced by something older, more grounded. One panel came down, then another, each piece set aside carefully, like even now they understood this was not something you handled carelessly. Behind the fence, doors began to open again. Not all at once. One at a time. A man stepped out onto his patio, pausing at the threshold like he was testing whether the space belonged to him again. A woman followed a few minutes later, stepping onto the grass, looking down at the markers, then back at the gap forming where the fence had been. No one crossed the line yet. Not until it was clear. Not until it was right. I walked slowly along the access strip, boots pressing into the same path that had never moved, never changed, just waited to matter. The crew had reached the center now, the exact point where everything had shifted days ago. One of them wiped his hands on his jeans, glancing at the exposed ground where the post had been anchored, then over at me. Should have checked the survey, he said, not accusatory, not defensive, just stating the obvious. I gave a small nod. Lines matter. He looked at me for a second, then back at the work, like that was all that needed to be said. Around noon, the county vehicle returned, slower this time, less urgent. The same official stepped out, clipboard in hand, walking the line again, but now with a different purpose. Verification, not discovery. He paused at the open section, looking down the access strip, then out toward the backyards beyond it. Clear path. No obstruction. He made a note, then moved on, checking each marker, each adjustment, confirming what had already been set in motion. Victoria stood off to the side, not in the center anymore, not directing, not controlling, just present, watching. Her posture was still straight, but the weight behind it had changed. Less performance, more acceptance. When the official finished, he approached her briefly, speaking in low tones, pointing toward the cleared section, then to the remaining panels that still needed to come down. She nodded once, no argument, no pushback, just acknowledgement. That was the final shift. Not in the land. In her. By mid-afternoon, the last section of fence that crossed my property was gone. The line was visible again, not marked by wood, but by space. Open, clear, exactly where it had always been. The markers remained for now, bright against the grass, but they felt different. Temporary. Like they were already on their way out. One by one, people stepped back into their yards. Slow at first. Careful. Then more certain. A chair moved. A grill uncovered. The quiet hum of a sprinkler system came back to life, water catching the sunlight as it arced across grass that was no longer restricted. The neighborhood sound returned, not all at once, but enough to feel the difference. I stopped at the center of the access strip, looking down its length, then back toward the houses beyond it. Nothing about the land had changed. Not really. It was still the same ground, the same measurements, the same boundaries my father showed me years ago. But now everyone saw it. Understood it, respected it. Victoria walked toward me slowly, stopping a few feet short, the same distance she had kept since the markers went in. For a moment, she did not speak, just looked at the open space where the fence had been, then at me. It will be corrected fully by the end of the day, she said, her voice even, controlled, but without the edge it used to carry. I nodded once. It already is. She held my gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning away. No apology, no argument, just closure. I stood there as the afternoon light softened, shadows stretching across the ground in long, quiet lines that no one would question anymore. The fence was never the real problem. It was just the first move. They thought they could take a few feet and no one would notice. But land does not forget where it begins. And rules do not care who writes them down, only who understands them. I turned back toward my house, the gravel crunching under my boots, the sound steady, familiar, unchanged. Because in the end, I did not take anything from them. I just made sure they could not use what they never had the right to begin with.